All right. Can people hear me? Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me now? Better? I'm getting a little sick. I know, I told you guys to be all healthy, and I woke up this morning and I was like, oh no. I feel a little bit terrible. All right, so I'm going to be unloading all of my usual things, but I guess that's what happens when it's time for you to have a 4-day weekend. You're going to get sick. But heed that, guys. Stay healthy for the next couple of weeks, okay? All right. I have exams. I dealt with that this weekend. So if you gave me your version A on Friday, I dealt with that. So come get it afterwards. Anybody else who hasn't picked up a test, they're here. This is the last time I am carrying this box of tests to lecture. Everybody else who is emailing me, you can come to office hours and pick up your test. Okay. And eCommons has been updated with all of the fixes. Okay. But double check. All right. Because if for some reason it didn't save the 1 point that I added to your score, look at it. Okay. Make sure, because those things are just human error, just like the math mistakes. Anything else? Lecture today, lecture Wednesday. We got to get through the endocrine system. So let's do that. This chapter's not so bad. It does tell you in the beginning of the chapter, and I should tell you that this is not, we're covering the endocrine system in kind of like an overview sense, which is why I wrote it like that. Because we got to get through kind of the organization of it, what it means to be an endocrine gland, master regulators of the endocrine system, like the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, actions of certain hormones, but we're not covering all hormones. For example, we're not really going to talk about estrogens and testosterone and reproductive hormones because that's in the reproductive chapter, which we're not doing. Okay. So lots of hormones have already been discussed where they are relevant in their own organ system. So really we're kind of focusing on the overview of the endocrine system, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, thyroid, calcium regulation, and the adrenal gland, and cortisol stress responses. It's kind of what we're going to go through in these 2 lectures. Master regulatory systems of homeostasis are, I said this in the first day of class. What systems regulate homeostasis? The endocrine system and the nervous system. Okay, so we said that really early on, and the endocrine system and the nervous system are kind of connected or integrated, and so that's where we're going to kind of focus today on this hypothalamus. Okay, that is like the president of the endocrine system, and where does it live? In the brain, and so it is nervous tissue and endocrine gland at the same time. Okay, and so I want to make sure that it's clear from a very, very big picture perspective that the endocrine system and the nervous system are coordinating the regulation of homeostasis body-wide through the different organ systems, and they are integrated with each other. Okay, what are we talking about today? We got to get through structure, function of hormones and endocrine glands and talk about all of those points. How hormones exert their actions, things that control hormone secretion in the body. Then we get to that hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and the major hormones of the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, and the generalized actions that they have, but we're not going very deep there. We will talk about the thyroid gland and thyroid hormones and their mechanisms of action. Hopefully we'll get through all of that today. That's my plan. Okay. So the job of the endocrine system, make and secrete hormones to regulate homeostasis. Okay. The endocrine system, and it's funny, it's kind of funny to me that your book doesn't have a picture of this. Oh, I put a picture of it from another book. Made up of the cells, tissues, and organs that secrete hormones. Which are the major ones that we're thinking about? The hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland exists too also in the brain. We're not really going to talk about that, but it makes something called melatonin that helps regulate your circadian rhythm. You have the thyroid and the parathyroid glands, the thymus involved in the immune system, adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. Kidneys can also make hormones. Your pancreas, which we'll talk about in the digestive system, ovaries and testes, even the heart makes a particular hormone. So the endocrine system isn't just like one organ or one tissue localized in one place. Endocrine glands are the cells and tissues of the endocrine system, and they are distributed throughout the body, is really what I'm trying to say with this picture, but your book doesn't have to have that picture. Okay, so the way that the endocrine system helps coordinate and regulate homeostasis is through hormones that allow communication between, for example, the brain, right, and the nervous system, and the actions of different target tissues throughout the body. And that's through the secretion of chemical messengers called hormones. I want to define a couple terms really quickly because it comes up on one of the first figures in this chapter in your book, and that's the difference between exocrine and endocrine. Okay? And there are things called exocrine glands, and we're going to talk about them in the digestive system for sure. And these are glands that secrete substances or products into ducts that end up being excreted. Okay? As opposed to the endocrine system, where secretions are meant to stay where? In the body. Okay? In the endocrine system, ultimately, we release hormones into the bloodstream so that they can be distributed throughout the body. An exocrine gland secretes stuff that is for excretion, like tears and like pancreas when we get there. Okay? Because we're going to see that on this slide. So hormones are secreted by things called endocrine glands. So this picture is showing you kind of the difference between an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. Both of them have usually like specialized epithelial cells that are made to secrete their products. In an exocrine gland, that secretion happens into a luminal space that ends up in some kind of a duct, and the duct is carrying that secretion ultimately to the place of excretion. Okay? In an endocrine gland, you often have like follicular epithelial cells that are secreting hormones, and they're ending up in the bloodstream. Okay? Your book calls them 3 major classes of hormones. There are amine hormones, peptide hormones, and steroid hormones. Oftentimes you'll find people saying there's steroid hormones and non-steroid hormones. Okay, and so we'll sort of go back and forth between those. But basically there are steroid hormones and non-steroid hormones. Okay, and we usually distinguish them by their mechanisms of action, mainly where they bind their receptors on their target cell and tissue, and whether the actions or their functions end up being fast responses or slow responses. Okay, so I'm just planting those seeds. But we'll look through them as amines, peptides, and steroids first, because that's the way your book has them set up. Steroid hormones are synthesized, all of them, from a cholesterol base, like estrogen, testosterone, aldosterone, cortisol. Those are all steroid hormones. Non-steroid hormones are made from amino acids, amines, proteins, even glycoproteins like norepinephrine, growth hormone, oxytocin, maybe ones that you've heard of before. All right, amine hormones. Your book is just showing you a bunch of structures of different amine hormones. The first 2 up there are the 2 thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, that both contain iodine and tyrosine groups. There are the catecholamine hormones, which we've talked about before when they're secreted into the bloodstream, norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay. Dopamine can also function as a hormone. And your book touches on that momentarily, but we won't talk about it too much. These are all amine-based hormones. And you probably remember that about dopamine from when we talked about it as a neurotransmitter. All right, what's next? Peptide hormones. Peptide and protein hormones. This is really the majority of hormones functioning in the body are peptide hormones. One example that you know of very well is insulin. Okay. The reason why they use insulin as an example is because it's a pretty classic way that we get peptide hormones in the body, and that is through an initial synthesis of something called a pre-pro hormone, which is really funny, which then gets processed in the cell into a prohormone, packaged into secretory vessels as a prohormone. Prohormone just means it's not really active yet. It's not in its biologically active form. Okay? And and they can be stored like that in cells that are making these hormones. And it's usually at the time of secretion that those prohormones are finally cleaved into their biologically active peptide fragments, if you want to think of it like that. And histamine. Insulin is an example of that. When insulin is released, it's synthesized as one long peptide called proinsulin. At the time of secretion, it is cleaved into insulin and something called C-peptide and then released into the bloodstream. Both insulin and C-peptide can be measured in the bloodstream in basically equal molar amounts because they're both released just like that. And oftentimes the different cleavage products of prohormones have their own actions. Okay, so we talk a lot about insulin, but C-peptide itself has its own action. And sometimes they're helpful or coordinated with the actual hormone peptide. But this is a pretty classic way that we give rise to peptide hormones. Okay, insulin is an example. Majority of hormones are peptide hormones. Let's talk about the steroid hormones. They're also ones that you've heard a lot about. Up in the top right, I shrunk it a lot, but this is just an image showing you that steroid hormones are all derived from cholesterol. So it's just showing you the structural relationship between cholesterol and the main steroid hormones, which are cortisol, aldosterone, testosterone, and estradiol. Okay, so you can see how chemically similar they are. That synthesis from cholesterol is occurring either in the adrenal cortex, for example, for cortisol, or in the gonads for testosterone and estradiol, the ovaries and the testes, or the placenta during pregnancy as well. I listed here main steroid hormones that are made in the adrenal cortex, but we're going to talk about that on the next slide also, and that the gonads are making estrogens, or estradiol mainly, is the active form of estrogen, and testosterone. Steroid hormones are lipid soluble, okay, which means what? They pass through what? They pass through cell membranes like cholesterol. You remember in cell bio when we talk about how there's cholesterol stuck in the membrane? Yeah. Okay. We're going to talk about this, but receptors for steroid hormones are inside, usually, their target cells because they can pass through the cell membrane. Okay. Steroid hormones, and we'll come back to this, are generally known for being, I guess you could say, slow-acting hormones. Okay. And that is that most of them function in the end like transcription factors. Okay? They tend to bind their receptors and cause the activation of second messenger cascades. This is also how they end up being synthesized. Okay? That ultimately result in changes in transcriptional activity, gene expression, protein synthesis. So they have longer duration, slower responses that are longer in duration, generally than peptide hormones, but we'll come back to that too. So let's quickly talk about the hormones that are produced by the adrenal gland, specifically. We have talked about a lot of them already in their with respect to the organ systems that they function in. So we're not going to talk too much about the individual hormones. And I'm not going to spend too much time here, but your book does talk about how the cortex of the adrenal gland is organized into distinct structural layers. The significance of that is that the structural layers of the adrenal cortex secrete different hormones that are made by the adrenal cortex. So oftentimes we just say this is secreted by the adrenal cortex, but if we're being really honest, different layers of the adrenal cortex are secreting different hormones. Okay? And then the medulla, of course, we know makes what? Okay. So really, if you were to zoom in on the adrenal cortex, you could divide it into 3 zones, which are listed here. Okay? And while I think all of them can make all of these hormones, it's which ones predominate from there. So aldosterone predominantly from the zona glomerulosa. Then cortisol mostly from the middle layer. Okay? And then the androgens are mostly produced by the innermost layer of the adrenal cortex, and the medulla is making epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay? All right, so different classes of hormones, yeah, where they are produced by endocrine glands. We looked a little bit at their structures. They're secreted by those follicular epithelial cells most of the time in those endocrine glands. Now, what happens to them once they're put into the bloodstream is kind of what we have to deal with. How do we transport the hormones? Okay. And if we think about it for a moment, we understand, most of us, because we've heard about it or learned about it a little bit before, hormones are secreted, they're put into the bloodstream, they need to exert some response in order to regulate some homeostatic parameter, right, or physiological parameter. But we don't necessarily need the hormone going at the same concentration or the same speed all of the time in the blood all of the time, right? So we want to be able to also regulate how much hormone is in the blood based on what we need to have happening in terms of the functional effect of that hormone in its target tissues, yeah? So we regulate that by not just transport in the blood, but also by excretion, by getting rid of it, right? We don't necessarily want it there all the time, yeah? I hope that makes sense. Like, think about the menstrual cycle, right, which is predominated by increases in estrogens and progesterones at different times, right? It doesn't work. The menstrual cycle doesn't work if you have estrogen high all of the time. Yeah, that's how birth control pills work. Okay, so we need to be able to regulate how much hormone is in the blood or transported in the blood, and we have to do it by either metabolizing it, breaking it down, or excreting it. So I want to talk about those 2 things. All right, so here's a table that is generalizing categories of hormones based kind of on what we talked about. So let's look at them first. They group the steroid hormones and the peptide hormones, which is kind of what we were thinking of, like steroid and non-steroid. But thyroid hormones tend to function very similarly in their mechanisms of action to steroid hormones, so they're grouped together. And peptide hormones and the catecholamines are also grouped together. The first question is, how are they transported in the blood? Okay. Peptide hormones and catecholamines are water-soluble, right? So they can just freely diffuse and be carried through the plasma. Okay. But the steroid hormones are fatty, right? They're cholesterol-based. So they are generally transported in the blood bound to carrier proteins like albumins or something else. Okay? I alluded to this already. We're going to look at it in the next couple of slides, but where are the receptors for these different categories of hormones? Steroid and thyroid hormones mainly have receptors inside the cell, okay, because they can pass through the cell membrane. Whereas peptides and catecholamines generally have plasma membrane-associated receptors that they bind and activate. And then they list here also the intracellular signaling mechanisms that are often activated by the hormone binding its receptor. We'll go there a little bit. And then they're getting to the place that I wanted to talk about, which is how are these things regulated? How quickly do they take effect? How long does their effect last? peptide hormones that bind plasma membrane receptors activate very fast-acting, generally, intracellular signaling cascades, and they exert very fast effects. Okay? They travel quickly, freely, and they're broken down and excreted quickly. Okay? Whereas steroid hormones that pass into the cell and bind their receptors, they not only elicit intracellularly slower responses because they're changing gene transcription, okay, but they are also more slowly metabolized and excreted because they're inside the cell, okay, which is mostly what we said here. When it comes to excretion from the blood, the liver and the kidneys are the major organs that are removing hormones, okay, and or metabolizing them. Sometimes hormones are secreted from their endocrine gland in a less active form than when they start getting metabolized, for example, in their target cells or organs. So that's another way that you can activate hormone function, okay, as part of the process of metabolism ends up activating that hormone before it's excreted. Okay, so this flowchart is just kind of synopsizing what we're going through. Okay, the endocrine cell secreting its hormone, it gets put into the bloodstream, and then all of the things that can happen to it. Okay, the main thing we think about is it binding its target cell and exerting its function. Okay, I just mentioned that this can happen, right? It can be put into the bloodstream, and in its target cell or tissue, it can be more activated as part of the metabolic process. Okay, or when it's time for it to go away, it can be metabolized, okay, broken up into products, and those products can be recycled or reused, but you have no more active hormone, yeah? Or you can excrete it this way, yeah? So we are able to make hormones, transport hormones, and then we got to figure out how those hormones get excreted, yeah, in order to regulate their amounts. Okay. And generally, the steroids and the thyroid hormones that are protein bound, they're even excreted from the blood. This process, the excretion process, is a lot slower because they're also bound to those plasma proteins. So that helps prolong their effect as well. Okay, so we can transport them. We can figure out how to regulate how much there is. We can excrete them or break them down. What do they do when they bind their receptors? Okay, because how does so let's say you have a hormone that's being released by the anterior pituitary gland. This is at the base of your brain. Okay, that might be a hormone that needs to act on the ovaries. Okay, so that the ovaries can produce estrogen, for example, during the right phase of the menstrual cycle. So you've got this pituitary gland at the base of your brain. It's dumping some hormone into the bloodstream that needs to act on the ovaries and not anywhere else in the body, just in that tissue, except the hormone is circulating through the bloodstream. How do we specify that only the ovaries are going to respond to that hormone circulating in the blood? Receptors. Okay, so I just want to make sure everybody's awake. Classic theme, right? This is how we make sure that we get specific cells responding to specific signals. If they don't have a receptor, they can't, right? So same deal with hormones, okay? The ability of a cell to respond to a hormone depends on the presence of a receptor, okay? That receptor, we've already alluded to, is either on the plasma membrane or inside the cell, okay? Receptors for steroid and thyroid hormones are generally inside the cell, because those hormones can pass through the membrane by themselves, yeah? Receptors for peptide and catecholamine hormones are generally on the plasma membrane of their target cells. What are some things hormones can do? They can influence target cells' sensitivity to themselves. So they can bind their receptor on a target cell or tissue, okay, even in its own endocrine gland, and cause up or down regulation of their own receptors, which changes the cell's sensitivity to their own presence. Some hormones can actually cause up or down regulation of another hormone's receptor. Okay? And then you've got two hormones that are kind of working together in some way. Your book talks about this as hormones permitting the action of other hormones, or permissiveness of hormone action. Okay? So that is, a hormone could cause upregulation of another hormone's receptor, meaning those cells are now more sensitive to the other hormone being present, so long as this first hormone is present. So this hormone is permitting the action of another hormone. Does that make sense? Okay. That can happen too. All right. So what happens when they bind their receptors? So I'm going to talk about them in general categories of steroid and non-steroid. Your book doesn't have these figures. These are just simple figures that I took from another book that I've used before, if you like visual versus speaking. But most of this you probably know from cell bio. Okay? So steroid hormones and thyroid hormones. I kind of said already, ultimately, their effect in their target cell is kind of like a transcription factor effect. Okay? So in general, they can pass through the cell membrane. Okay? Their receptors tend to be inside the cell, or even more so inside the nucleus, because they can pass through both membranes. Okay? The hormone receptor complex very often functions as a transcription factor or activates a transcription factor or functions as a cofactor in transcription so as to change gene expression, which ultimately will change, the protein expression profile of that cell. Let's say the action was to upregulate the receptor of another hormone, right? Like we just talked about on the last slide. Those results are slow, okay? Because you have to activate gene transcription or repress gene transcription, and you ultimately have to change protein expression as a result of that, okay? So those are slower responses. Yeah? Okay. This is a generalization, okay? For example, when you think about estradiol and progesterones, they're mainly functioning like this, but there is, for example, a plasma membrane receptor for estradiol so that it can have, in parallel, fast effects on the cell, immediate effects on the cell, and also changing gene expression, okay? But more often than not, we think of steroid and thyroid hormones as slow acting in the sense that they're changing the overall transcriptional profile of a cell as part of their functional effect. Okay? As opposed to generalizing peptide and catecholamine hormones, okay? Where in this case we have a hormone that binds a plasma membrane receptor. You often get activation of intracellular signaling cascades that you have talked about in cell biology before. This can be like the activation of a G protein, which activates adenylate cyclase, right? Increases levels of CAMP. CAMP activates protein kinases, in particular intracellular signaling pathways that can ultimately activate or inactivate some process very rapidly inside the cell. Okay? And this is how you get very rapid effects. Okay? Quick effects often from this type of signaling cascade. Again, a generalization. Can you get slow gene transcription changes from these kinds of hormones also? Yes. Okay? You can get fast effects, and you could get slow effects. Like, for example, if you need to phosphorylate a particular transcription factor in order for it to be activated and function so you can change the gene expression profile, that can happen too. Okay? So while we categorize steroid hormones as slow-acting transcription factor-like, and we categorize peptide-based hormones as fast-acting intracellular signaling cascade activation-like, they can both do the other thing, is what I'm trying to say. Okay? I want to generalize, but I also want to be real. Okay, so their mechanisms of action, how they bind the receptors and what they do. How do you control whether or not a hormone is going to get secreted at all? Right? So what is it that makes an endocrine gland actually make its hormone and secrete it? Nervous system. Okay, we've talked about that, right? Because we've talked about it in terms of the adrenal medulla, right? In chapter 6. Yeah? Yes. Okay, it's where those preganglionic fibers are terminating on the adrenal medulla, and it makes the adrenal medulla do what? In response to sympathetic stimulation, make epinephrine and norepinephrine and dump it in the bloodstream just like a hormone. Yes, the nervous system can stimulate the secretion of hormones. What else? I'm making you say it before I show you this stupid flowchart from your book. What else? Levels of things in the blood. So give me an example. So what kinds of things are there in the blood? Please tell me that you have learned something in the last 9 weeks. What's in the blood? Okay, well, hemoglobin, yeah. Okay. What kinds of things in the blood are we trying to regulate? Like, what do we care about in terms of physiology and homeostasis in the blood? Like, chapter 6. Right. Glucose is a great example, right? Yeah? We want to know how much glucose is in the blood. And if there's a lot of glucose in the blood, do we want it to stay in the blood? Where do we want it to go? Into some cells, because it's an energy source, right? This is a carbon source. We break it down, we make what? ATP. Okay. All right. Okay. I'm going to stop. Wake up. Okay. So things in the blood can influence whether an endocrine gland is going to make its hormone. Yeah? The nervous system can influence whether an endocrine gland is going to make and secrete its hormone. Yeah? Other hormones can influence whether an endocrine gland is going to make and secrete its hormone. So all of those ways can get you a hormone. We're being very general. Okay? Let's use a really classic example. Glucose. Right? So glucose, high levels of glucose in the blood. Yeah? When that's happening, you want to get that glucose out of the blood and give it to the cells that need it. Yeah? It's in order to use energy, store energy in the body. To do that, you need insulin. Yeah? Which is a hormone produced by the pancreas, which we're not going to talk about today, but we'll talk about all next week. Insulin helps you move that glucose from the plasma into cells. Okay? So in response to high glucose concentration, you get the pancreas making insulin. Okay? Yeah? Which allows the actions of insulin to take place, like transport glucose from the plasma, right, into those cells. And there's a negative feedback loop, because as that's happening, as the result of hormone action, glucose levels in the plasma are doing what? Going down. So now do we need insulin around anymore? Do we want it hanging around in the blood at the same concentration all the time? Okay, so just rewind yourself to like 3 or 4 slides ago when we were talking about excretion, right? Metabolizing those hormones quickly so that they do what they need to do and then they get out of the way, right? Because we want to regulate, we want to maintain concentration of glucose in the blood and within a really narrow window, right? Just like most other parameters that we're trying to physiologically maintain. Yeah? Yes? Okay. So here, let's go here for a minute. To the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is a neural input, right? It's a neural input that does control the secretion of many hormones in the body. Okay? So you've got situations where you have nerve cell or neural cell terminating, their axons terminating, both from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. directly onto endocrine glands or cells within endocrine glands that control their secretory activity, basically. Okay, so I'm leading you into this hypothalamus pituitary, which is where we're going. Okay, so we're going to focus we did glucose as an example, but we're going to focus for a little bit on neuronal control of hormone secretion. Okay, so we've talked about some of these things, how fibers of the autonomic nervous system can influence the formation of a hormone. Yeah, we've done this. Yeah. It doesn't always have to positively influence, right? We can stimulate it or inhibit it from happening. The president of the endocrine system, is how I always talk about it, is the hypothalamus. Okay, we're going to talk about the hypothalamus controlling the release of several hormones throughout the body, and it usually does so in like this 3-step pathway. Okay, we've got to make sense out of this 3-step pathway. Okay, but the hypothalamus, the president, speaks directly with the pituitary, which anatomically is right there, right? So remember the anatomy here, your hypothalamus is in the middle base of your brain, like in a place that I can't point at it, right? And then tissue-wise, coming down off of it like a little teardrop is this teeny tiny little pituitary gland that sits inside this little bony casing at the base of the skull. Okay? The hypothalamus is the president, making the pituitary the vice president. Okay? Hypothalamus tells the pituitary what to do. Okay? And then the pituitary secretes hormones that go into the systemic circulation. We're going to talk about how that's regulated. Okay? Into systemic circulation that then tells other endocrine glands in the body what to do. Okay? So step 3 is whatever the hypothalamus said, the pituitary said, the hormone went into the bloodstream and told the ovary what to do, and then the ovary made estrogen. Okay, so it's a kind of a hierarchy. So let's look at this. Okay, anatomy. Remember, your hypothalamus is here. This is a cross-section through the brain this way. The pituitary is an extension from, it's anatomically connected, but also an extension of the hypothalamus. Okay, so really zoomed in picture here. Okay, we have 2 kinds of neurons or nuclei, if you want to think of them like that, in the hypothalamus. Okay, there are the supraoptic nuclei, and they are terminating on the posterior pituitary, which is here. And then you have paraventricular nuclei that are also going there. Okay. All right. So hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. We've got to make sense out of all of this. Okay. And they're showing you blood circulation here. Capillaries. We got to talk about those capillaries because these are capillaries involved in a portal system, which we have to make sense out of. Okay. So let's talk about the posterior pituitary first. In my head, it's kind of the easier one. The posterior pituitary itself doesn't actually make any hormones. Okay? It just secretes hormones. How is that happening? Well, neurons from the hypothalamus that are terminating in the posterior pituitary like this, their axons are terminating in the posterior pituitary, and they're physically terminating on the capillaries in the posterior pituitary, which means the hormones are actually being made by who? These cells of the hypothalamus that are terminating on the posterior pituitary. Okay? So really all the posterior pituitary does in response to a signal is release hormones that were technically made by hypothalamic neurons. Everybody okay with that? No?
So when they're releasing their neurotransmitters, is it their neurotransmitters that are the hormones?
Yeah, so we've talked about that happening, right? Sometimes neurotransmitters are hormones because we put them directly in the bloodstream.
Right, like at the...
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Everybody okay with that? Okay. there are neurons of the hypothalamus who are making certain hormones that have to signal to the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary, because the anterior pituitary's endocrine cells actually make their own hormones. Okay? But they're only going to do so if President Hypothalamus says do it. So, in terms of the anterior pituitary, okay, you have neurons up here in the hypothalamus that are terminating on these blood vessels right here in the median eminence, which is the anatomical capillary bed that's in the infundibulum between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. They're releasing a hormone. That hormone, they're usually called releasing hormones. We're gonna get there. That hormone has to tell only the anterior pituitary what to do, because it's got its own endocrine cells that are then going to release a hormone that we want in the systemic circulation. Is that okay? All right. So to be really efficient, the best thing we could do, because like they're right next to each other, right? Like they're so close to each other. It's kind of a waste for this hypothalamus to make a releasing hormone whose site of action is right there on the anterior pituitary gland and dump it into systemic circulation and then wait for it all to like come back around and cycle through the anterior pituitary and then have the anterior pituitary know what to do. Yeah? Instead, there's like a specialized blood system here, or two capillary beds ultimately, that allows the hypothalamus to put a releasing hormone into the blood right here. But this blood in the capillary network of the median eminence is not directly draining into a vein which is going to put that hormone into the systemic circulation. It's draining into a second capillary bed. We're going to zoom in on this, okay? That secondary capillary bed goes straight to the anterior pituitary, so that the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus hits the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary right away. Because really the only hormone that we need in this three-step cycle is the one from the anterior pituitary to be released in response to the releasing hormone, because it's going to go get put into the bloodstream, systemic circulation, okay, to go act on the ovaries where it needs to go. Okay, we're going to keep coming back to this, so I just wanted to explain it once at least here. Okay. Why are we doing this? Why do we have this special portal system, blood system? I have it zoomed in, picture of it on the next slide, because I said that a lot of times it is the hypothalamus who regulates whether some other endocrine gland is going to make its hormone. Like we could just stay with the ovary example, right? The ovaries are the only things that make estrogen. Okay? So, but the hypothalamus ultimately is telling it to do so, let's say. Okay? The hypothalamus makes a hormone. These are often called releasing hormones. Okay? It gets put into these portal vessels right there, because it's just going to the anterior pituitary, which is going to secrete another hormone that are usually called stimulating hormones. This is the releasing hormone. This is the stimulating hormone. And then the anterior pituitary puts it into the plasma, puts it into the bloodstream, right? And then it goes and hits its endocrine gland, let's say the thyroid or the ovary, okay? And then it makes its hormone, and that hormone has its action. Yeah? So it makes sense then, if the anterior pituitary is making a lot of the hormones, remember posterior isn't making a lot of them, it's just secreting them, and it's really only secreting two of importance. Hypothalamus makes a releasing hormone, puts it into the portal system here. Therefore, it goes directly before it bypasses venous circulation, systemic circulation. It hits the second capillary bed in the anterior pituitary first. It releases its stimulating hormone, and then we drain into the venous circulation and go into the system with that second hormone. Okay, this portal system is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Okay. I said all of this already. We're just zooming in a more simple way, where the hypothalamus makes its releasing hormone. Those are often also called tropic hormones. Okay? Hormones that tell other endocrine glands to secrete hormones are often called tropic hormones. We go into the portal system here. That means this releasing hormone is taken directly to the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary gland, telling them to secrete their stimulating hormone and then put it into the systemic blood supply. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so because it's easier, we can get it out of the way faster, let's deal with the posterior pituitary hormones first. Okay? Is the posterior pituitary making their own hormone? No. They're just releasing hormones that were technically just made by the hypothalamic neurons. Okay, and I kind of reminded you of that there. The two major hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary are oxytocin and vasopressin. We've spent a lot of time with this one and what it is. Okay, I'm not going to go there. I'm not even going to really go a lot into oxytocin. Does anybody know what oxytocin does? Isn't it for birth? Yes, it is for birth. It is. It's a hormone that ultimately stimulates contraction of smooth muscle in the uterus, okay, and also influences certain cells in the mammary glands as well. Oxytocin levels go up during labor. There is a trigger releasing lots of oxytocin. All of a sudden during labor, it causes very intense uterine contractions that ultimately help you deliver a baby, okay? When people are not progressing quickly through labor in the hospital, doctors are very readily try and speed that up by administering a synthetic oxytocin, which is called Pitocin. So if you work in a hospital, if you've heard of anybody getting Pitocin to speed up labor, that happens all the time. I'm going to keep my opinion on that to myself. I got Pitocin, then I ended up in an emergency C-section. That happens a lot. Okay, your body can make its own. Okay, so posterior pituitary, these are its two main hormones. Remember, they're not actually made by any endocrine cells in the posterior pituitary because it's just releasing these two hormones into the bloodstream. Because if you look at that picture back, why would I do that? The capillary network in the posterior pituitary is draining directly into the venous blood supply, directly into the venous system. Okay, so there's no portal system in here. The portal system is in the anterior pituitary. Okay? All right. Let's talk about the anterior pituitary because it's the biggie. Remember, hypothalamus says, hey, anterior pituitary, secrete something. Okay? It does so by making a releasing hormone. And we're going to look at that a little more on the next slide. But then the anterior pituitary has to make whatever hormone the hypothalamus told it to make. The major hormones synthesized and secreted by the anterior pituitary are, in that yellow box, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Both of those influence the gonads, the ovaries and the testes. Follicular development of germ cells, basically sperm and eggs. They trigger the release of gonadotropins or gonadahormones, which are testosterone and estrogens. Okay? Luteinizing hormone also triggers ovulation during the menstrual cycle. Anterior pituitary also makes growth hormone, which is obviously important for growth and development. It acts on the liver, other cells. It acts all over the body, really. Anterior pituitary makes something called thyroid-stimulating hormone, which, what do you think that does? Tells the thyroid to do what? Secrete thyroid hormones, right? So it's pretty, like this three-step pathway is pretty consistent, okay? Hypothalamus said anterior pituitary make thyroid-stimulating hormone so that thyroid-stimulating hormone can act on the thyroid and the thyroid can secrete its hormones, okay? Prolactin is also made by the anterior pituitary, another hormone that plays a role in lactation, okay? Acts in the breast, in the mammary glands to stimulate milk production, and then oxytocin also helps for milk ejection because it causes smooth muscle contractions in the mammary gland, okay? Both involved in breastfeeding. And then ACTH is also made by the anterior pituitary that tells the adrenal cortex to make cortisol. We'll talk more about ACTH when we talk about cortisol and the stress response. Okay? So these are the major hormones of the anterior pituitary and their general actions in the body. Okay? This is me reminding you that the only reason that the anterior pituitary is making these hormones is because what? Hypothalamus said to do it. Okay? So here's like a mushing together of that idea. The hypothalamus, we just talked about all these, right? And what they do. So we can kind of like ignore this part for a minute. Okay? Why would the anterior pituitary make all of these? Because the hypothalamus released a tropic hormone. Usually it's a releasing hormone. Why? That's why they almost all of them end in RH. RH stands for releasing hormone. Okay? And a lot of these ones are TSH, FSH. It's a stimulating hormone to stimulate another gland. Okay? So gonadotropin releasing hormone releases the gonadotropins. They act on the gonads. Okay? Growth hormone releasing hormone. That one's really inventive. Okay? And then whether they stimulate or inhibit production. Okay? And then at the end of the table, it tells you what's going on here. The hormones that we really need to know for this system, that you need to know like for your test, are the ones that we are going to go through by hand. Okay? You need to know the names of these things, but we're going to talk, for example, about the 2 thyroid hormones. That's a really big deal. Okay? So organize yourselves well, just like we have been talking about hormones before and throughout other systems. Okay? And you've had to know their actions. Okay. So, hypothalamus tells the pituitary what to do. The pituitary tells everybody else what to do, and ultimately you get hormones secreted that exert their functions, on target cells and tissues that carry receptors for those hormones. Everybody okay with that? Okay. Let's talk about the thyroid gland. Where is it? It's laying right on your trachea. Okay. It's kind of hard to find. It's not as much tissue as you would expect. Sometimes when you go to the doctor, they're feeling it. They like push on your trachea a little bit, and you're like, "What the hell are you doing? That feels weird." They're just feeling it and making sure there isn't some hypertrophy of the thyroid, just like when they go to feel your lymph nodes, right? That there isn't like a swelling going on that's slightly abnormal. You can have hypertrophy of the thyroid, which ultimately, I mean, maybe you have thought about goiters before. You read about them in the book, where the thyroid can be overstimulated. Cells of the thyroid can be overstimulated to grow, and you would feel that, and we'll talk about that. So that's where it is. It's kind of like a little butterfly shape. It's bilobed, I guess you could think of it like that. It's true that on the 2 lobes of the thyroid gland, it's not being shown to you in this picture, but we'll get there, are 2 little dots that are usually pointed out called the parathyroid gland. So the parathyroid gland is sitting on or in the thyroid gland. We're ignoring it for right now because it secretes its own hormones that help regulate calcium homeostasis. So we'll go there when we get to calcium homeostasis, but for now we're stuck on just thyroid. Parathyroid just means next to, right? Yeah. Okay. So structure of the cells in the the thyroid gland are pretty unique. You have follicular epithelial cells, which you're looking at here. These are the follicular epithelial cells, and they surround a protein-rich kind of gelatinous space called the colloid. Okay? And we'll kind of come back to that. The follicular cells do produce and secrete the thyroid hormones. Movement of chemicals, like movement of things from the follicular cells in the bloodstream in and out of the colloid does happen. We'll look at it on the next slide as part of the process of synthesizing and secreting the thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones contain iodine. There are 2 major thyroid hormones, and they're often just called T3 and T4. The 3 and the 4 just stand for how many iodines are on that molecule. They are otherwise the same. Okay? T3 is triiodothyronine, and thyroxine is T4. Okay? T3 is the major thyroid hormone because that is really the active thyroid hormone. Although levels of T4 in the blood are usually 4 to 5 times higher than T3. Why? Because T4, thyroxine in the blood, is kind of like a reservoir for T3 because target cells or tissues convert T4 to T3, and then the T3 is actually the active form, biologically active form, or more active form, I guess you could say. So in case anyone knows someone who takes thyroxine because they are hypothyroid, that is T4. And the reason why that works is because T4 is converted to T3 inside target cells and tissues. Okay? All right. So I don't need you to memorize this. Okay? I'm just going to kind of go through it once because I just want you to see some differences. And I kind of pointed them out mainly in my text. Okay? So we need iodine to make thyroid hormones. Okay? That iodine is transported from the blood, interstitial fluid, into the follicular epithelial cells of the thyroid gland, which are surrounding what again? That colloid. Okay? So we got to bring iodine in. Okay? That iodine is transported all the way into the colloid. Okay? There, we have this protein called thyroglobulin. Okay? Thyroglobulin is bound to tyrosine residues. The iodide is then oxidized and attached to the tyrosine residues that are attached to thyroglobulin. You can attach 2 iodines or just 1, like right here. Okay? The enzyme responsible for doing that is a thyroid peroxidase. Okay? Once this has happened, your book says the mechanistic process is kind of unknown, but basically this process happens again. Okay? And if you end up with 2 iodines on this one and 1 here, we end up with T3 because how many iodines are there? Mm-hmm. And if you end up with 2 each iodines, you end up with T4. Okay? So this process, the oxidation, the attachment of the iodides to the tyrosine residues in the attached form to thyroglobulin, is happening in the colloid. Okay? Then this whole thing is transported back into the follicular cells. Okay? We have like in a vesicle, effectively, which fuses to lysozymes that are containing enzymes that are going to cut T3 and T4 off this thyroglobulin. And when that happens, T3 and T4 diffuse into the interstitial space and then are released into the bloodstream. Okay? So things that are important. We need to get the iodine from the diet. Okay? If we don't have enough iodine in our diet, this process is limited. Okay? The structure of the follicles in the thyroid gland and the colloid and the way this process happens actually allows your thyroid to store, in a way, a lot of thyroid hormone. Okay? Like your book says something like several weeks worth. So that if there was no iodine in the diet for a few weeks, you kind of have enough thyroid hormones stored up to deal with that. Okay? But that if you have chronic lack of iodine in your diet, you will have effectively hypothyroidism. You will have a decrease in the amount of thyroid hormones that you can synthesize. Okay, and we'll talk about that too. How does the thyroid hormone know to make its hormones? The hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Okay, so in response to TSH, okay, and that's what we're showing you right here. Hypothalamus secretes the thyroid-releasing hormone, tells the anterior pituitary to make thyroid-stimulating hormone. That tells the thyroid to make T3 and T4. If T3 and T4 are high enough in the plasma, what do we do to regulate homeostasis? Negative feedback. Okay? Hypothalamus, stop it. Stop telling everybody to make more thyroid hormone. And if the levels drop, that negative feedback diminishes. Yeah, you can also influence both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, actually. And then it'll turn back on. Okay? What do they do, these T3 and T4? They have major effects on metabolism. They do have some permissive action that your book talked about, and they influence growth and development. So let's think about that. Let's think about all the things that thyroid hormones do. T3 ultimately increases the metabolic rate. Okay? So how is it doing that? It stimulates the absorption in the gut of carbohydrates and the release of fatty acids that are stored. Okay? So it's helping you burn calories. Yeah.
Is that what's in fat burning pills?
I don't know. Well, there's a lot of different fat burning pills. But no, I don't think it's thyroid hormones that are in it. I don't think we can just sell thyroid hormones at CVS. Yeah. But there's a lot of things that people sell as fat burning pills. But if people are hyperthyroid, they're super skinny. Okay? Because their metabolism is like on fire, man. They're just burning calories all the time. This makes a lot of heat in the body too. Okay? Because the process of burning ATP in a higher metabolism releases heat. Okay? So high metabolism, increased heat production. What's its permissive effect? It actually upregulates beta-adrenergic receptors, and it does so specifically in places like the heart and in the nervous system. So you have a lot of T3, you up those beta-adrenergic receptors, it makes you more sensitive to what? Epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay? So you are not only super skinny and hot, you're what? You're kind of jittery. Okay? Kind of anxious. Rapid heart rate. Okay? You are all of those things like high metabolism, high sympathetic activity. Yeah? Okay. T3 is also required in growth and development. Not just growth and development like in a child who doesn't have enough thyroid hormone, has growth deficiencies. That's true. Okay? But also during fetal development is really important for the development of the nervous system. It promotes the migration of axons, the growth of dendrites and dendritic spines during development. There is something called congenital hypothyroidism. Okay? This is fetal hypothyroidism, usually as a result of insufficient iodine in the diet of the mother. Okay? And unless this is recognized, supplemented, or treated right away, you usually have serious issues with mental retardation in the born baby. Okay? T3 is also important for nervous system function in adults too. Okay? Not just in a developing fetus. People who are lacking T3 for long enough can ultimately have issues with nerve and muscle reflexes and even with cognition. Okay, so let's think about those two things. Let's think about hypo and hyperthyroidism. What do they mean? Hypo means too little thyroid hormone. Okay, something's wrong with your thyroid gland. It's not making enough. Yeah? Hyperthyroidism, too much. Okay, so why would those things happen? Okay, so hypothyroidism, I've already alluded to, can be caused by iodine deficiency in the diet. Okay, in general, that's kind of rare nowadays because we do things like add it to salt. Okay, but that's why it was added to salt. Make sure everybody's getting enough iodine in their diet. Can that lead to hypothyroidism? Sure. Okay, what might happen there? You can develop something called a goiter. Has anybody seen people with large It almost looks like a swelling in the neck. This is the thyroid gland getting stimulated to overproduce. It's over-proliferating. The tissue is actually over-proliferating. Why is that happening if you don't have enough iodine in your diet? Because your body's trying to do what? Your hypothalamus is like, what the heck is going on? Right? I don't have enough thyroid hormone, so it keeps secreting what? TRH, and then the anterior pituitary keeps secreting what? TSH, and all of that is telling the thyroid gland not just to go through the chemical process of making T3 and T4 like we looked at, okay? But there are also membrane or intracellular receptors that are mediating gene transcription and cell division cycle, genes that are involved in the cell division cycle. So not only would we chemically synthesize more T3 and T4, right? But the hypothalamus is trying to say, please grow more cells to do this if the cells that you don't, if the cells that you have are not making enough. So you get an overgrowth, right? A hypertrophy, which can cause a goiter in this case. Okay? Most of the time, though, hypothyroidism is caused by something called Hashimoto's disease. This is an autoimmune disease, strangely, that my stepmom actually had like a year or two ago. Okay, here you have your immune system attacking the cells of the thyroid and destroying them. So they're not capable of making enough T3 and T4. Okay, what are the symptoms of hypothyroidism? Weight gain, fatigue, cold intolerance, changes in skin tone, cognition, right? If the thyroid hormones are the things that are stimulating or promoting high metabolic rate, if you get rid of them, you kind of have the opposite of high metabolic rate. Okay, weight gain, okay, slowing down, fatigue. You're not producing all that heat by a high metabolic rate anymore, okay. Thyroid hormones have actions on cells all throughout the body. They have really widespread effects. So the list is technically longer than this, but I'm trying to be concise. Okay, the opposite, hyperthyroidism. This, strangely, most of the time is also a result of an autoimmune disorder, just one that mechanistically functions a different way. Okay? I should say, though, like I said, iodine deficiency can cause hypothyroidism. You could have a tumor in the cells of the thyroid that cause an overproduction of thyroid hormone, but that's very rare. Most of the time, we are talking about Graves' disease causing hyperthyroidism. It's an autoimmune disease where you are making antibodies, but against a product on the cells of the thyroid. But this antibody specifically binds the TSH receptors. Okay? And when it binds the TSH receptors, it activates them. So it acts like thyroid stimulating hormone. Yeah? So it tells those cells, the binding of the autoimmune antibody to the receptor, tells those cells to produce more T3 and T4. So you have overproduction. Okay, so you have lots of T3 around. What's going to happen to you? You're super skinny. Okay? You're super hot. You are irritable and anxious because you've got high sympathetic activity going on, specifically to your heart. You can have rapid heart rate. Okay? Often a goiter here too, because remember, it's not just synthesize chemically more T3 and T4. We also have an activating gene transcription, activating the cell cycle effect of thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay? Hopefully everything's going back to like half